All right, welcome again. Thank you everybody for joining us for our presentation today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Erin Crowell and I'm in the marketing department here at Marcum. And just need to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. Marcum LLP and Marcum Technology LLC have prepared these materials as part of an educational program. The information contained herein is of a general nature and is not intended to address the circumstances of any particular individual, entity, or case. While every effort has been made to offer current and accurate information, errors can occur. Furthermore, laws and regulations referred to in this program may change over time and should be interpreted only in light of particular circumstances. The information presented here should not be construed as legal, tax, accounting, or valuation advice. No one should act on such information without appropriate professional advice after a thorough examination of the particular situation. During today's program, you can submit questions to our presenters using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom platform. They will get to as many questions as they can throughout and at the end of the webinar. We will also provide a copy of the slides and a link to the recording to all attendees in an email post-event. And if you would like to receive continuing professional education credits for CPAs for attending today's session, you'll need to be active in the Zoom platform for a minimum of 50 minutes and answer 3 of the 4 polling questions that will appear on the screen at random points during the presentation. Each poll will be active for about 1 minute. There are no right or wrong answers, but be sure to submit a response for tracking purposes. And now we'll pass it over to Buu-Linh Tran, Vice President of Financial Solutions at Marcum Technology.
Thank you, Erin. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on Implement Lease Accounting Standards, ASC 842 with ease. We should have a great presentation today. So in the next hour, we're going to be talking about ASC 842 and LeaseQuery. LeaseQuery is a solution that helps organizations with implementing ASC 842. Good afternoon, I'm Buu-Linh Tran. I'm a VP in our Financial Solutions practice at Marcum Technology. And just a quick intro, I've over 25 years experience working with a number of ERP solutions, including Sage Intacct and Dynamics GP. I've spent most of my career working with clients, bringing efficiencies to their back office accounting operations with technology. We have a special guest today, Jason Parker with LeaseQuery. Jason, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Buu-Linh. Yes, my name is Jason Parker. I work for LeaseQuery, and I am today a senior alliance manager with the organization. So my role is to oversee the relationships that we build with technology and CPA firms like Marcum. So I'm excited to be here today to join Buu-Linh. Just as far as a brief background on my career, I too started in audit at KPMG and had a few years under my belt, and then transitioned to LeaseQuery in a sales consulting role. So I spent a handful of years as our lead solutions consultant, demoing how our product meets the needs for ASC 842. And now I've moved into more of a business partnerships role. So today, do a little bit of both, walking you guys through a little bit of an intro on the 842 standard, what qualifies as a lease, and then we will actually get into the software. But I will pass it over to Buu-Linh again. She's going to give an intro into Marcum Technologies, and then we'll go over an agenda for the presentation.
Great. Next slide, please. So today's agenda. So we're going to talk just briefly who we are. And then also I want to talk a little bit, provide some background, who is LeaseQuery, and then provide just a recap of the new standard. And then we'll talk a little bit about how LeaseQuery integrates with some of the popular ERP solutions out there. Now we can't address this is only a 1-hour presentation. We won't be able to look at all of the ERP solutions out there, but we are going to focus on 2 of the cloud-based solutions, and they are Sage Intacct and Acumatica. And then this is a technology webinar, so we are going to go in and do an overview of what LeaseQuery looks like, and then we'll wrap it up with some Q&A. Next slide, please. So next slide. So who are we? Marcum and Marcum Technology. So Marcum Technology is the technology arm of Marcum LLP. And Marcum LLP is a CPA firm. As a firm, we service a number of industries here, as you can see. Next slide, please. Within Marcum Technology, we have 5 pillars of services. As you can see there, we've got cloud and infrastructure solutions, where we work with clients on a number of infrastructure projects, disaster recovery. So a number of those type of services is provided through that practice. We also have managed IT services. So for organizations that want to outsource their entire IT back office operations like help desks, we step in and provide that services to many organizations. And then we've got cybersecurity and digital forensic, where we work with clients to secure their business. And then digital consulting, a number of services there, including financial, ERP, and FP&A solution. That's a practice I'm part of. And within the financial ERP, we support and implement a number of ERP solutions, and 2 of which are cloud-based, which we're going to be talking about later on in this presentation, and there's Sage Intacct and Acumatica. But we also support 2 legacy systems, Dynamics GP, used to be called Great Plains, and Dynamics SL. And we also support a number of FP&A, implement support, and they are Vena and Planful. And finally, we've got strategic consulting, where we, a lot of our clients come to us for assessment work to really review their back office operations, whether organizations want to upgrade their ERP or they're looking for ways to improve, bring in efficiencies through technology. Next slide, please. So Jason, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Buu-Linh, again. And so as far as an intro to LeaseQuery, for those of you that are unfamiliar, so we are a subledger to the GL that offers automated compliance with all of the new lease accounting guidance. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the ASC 842 standard, because as a private entity, I imagine that most of you are. This past year would be when you would be adopting the 842 standard. So we were founded about 12 years ago. And I think the key here is that we were founded by someone in the accounting industry. So our CEO, George Aziz, he was previously both a corporate accounting in a Fortune 200 company, and he also worked in public accounting for several years, and ultimately determined that there wasn't even technology built to service him when he was trying to handle leases, even prior to the announcement of 842. When they announced 842 as an upcoming project with the FASB, he realized this might actually be a business runway. So fast forward 12 years later, we are servicing over 3,000 customers with presence in 93 different countries, whether it's 842, IFRS 16, state and local government accounting with FASB 87. And then we are also entering the federal market this year to offer compliance with SFAS 54, the new guidance for federal agencies. And if you look at the bottom, just couple key statistics about LeaseQuery. So we do currently have a 99% retention rate with our client base, which to me is an astronomical number given the volume of customers that we have, especially ones that are on an annual contract with us. And I think it speaks to not only the quality of the product we offer, but the service behind the product, all of the expertise that we offer from a support perspective, as well as the continuing development of the product. And part of that development does involve integrations with some of the products that Buu-Linh had mentioned. Sage Intacct and Acumatica are both official partners of LeaseQuery. So we have strong integrations built with those, and we'll talk through those in a little bit. But that's a little bit about what LeaseQuery is as far as an organization. Also, just a reminder, there is a polling question open, so make sure that you guys answer those as we're going along. The last thing I wanted to bring up in regards to LeaseQuery is this G2 grid report. Now, we bring this up because what this does is compares vendors within a specific industry. So this is encompassing all lease accounting softwares. And G2 is a third-party review site where actual users of the system will go in and review and rate softwares in various categories. And you can see here that LeaseQuery serves clearly as the market leader in the space. And a couple of the areas that we highly succeed in within the G2 evaluation is A, ease of use in the platform. Nobody wants to invest in accounting technology that's complex and hard to use. And then also the support that we offer after implementation. That's a huge piece because, again, you're going to implement the product relatively quickly, no matter which product you use, as long as you are prepared for the implementation. But over the course of you using that product over the next several years, you want to make sure that you have people at your disposal that actually understand how the tool works and the accounting behind it. So we do stand out quite well in the G2 grid report. So with that, we can go ahead and get into some of the detail related to 842. Now, we're not going to spend a ton of time in today's presentation covering this information. We hope that many of you already know a lot of this information and that we're just reviewing some of this. But of course, we will go into some of the basics related to the 842 standard here. And please feel free to throw some questions in the questions box within the Zoom. I can't guarantee we will get to all of them today, but I'm sure we will try to answer those as we go along. And I will say, Buu-Ling, for you as well, if you would like to ask any questions yourself or pose any comments, everybody is very willing to hear you interrupt me as we go along. So with that,
Jason, let me just say this, yes. The two previous slides that you showed, those numbers, they're just amazing numbers. And, as someone that have worked with a lot of organizations helping, companies automate and improve their accounting operations, right? And I would say that once, you leverage a solution like LeaseQuery to manage the leases and the accounting and the reporting, right? It's almost, you really couldn't go backward and do things, to capture it or to manage it in Excel and the risk. And then also depending on the number of leases that you have, right? And it's just having solutions like this really have its place and really does make, a lot of organizations, a lot of people's lives much easier.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, very, very worthwhile commentary there. And I will say, I think one of the things that we may not touch on quite as much in the slide deck, but I'll try to touch on while we demo, is the value you get using this tool in comparison to trying to do this in an Excel spreadsheet. Because a lot of people in the software industry always talk about who their competitors are in the space via other software vendors, but really Excel is often the biggest competitor when we think about accounting technology, because people try to get away with doing a lot of this manually. But I do think that the obvious future is automating a lot of this utilizing technology like LeaseQuery, Sage Intacct, Acumatica, et cetera. But thinking about the new leasing standard, and if we just ask the question why, rather than just digging into what it is, why did the FASB actually issue this ASU? And the main reason, of course, is to increase both transparency and comparability amongst organizations by recognizing the assets and liabilities on the balance sheet or the statement of financial position, as well as adding some key disclosures. So one example that we always like to talk through at LeaseQuery is Delta. And you can really think of any airlines organization, but a lot of times airlines will lease their fleet of planes from either Boeing or Airbus or any other provider. And typically those are constructed as operating leases because the contracts wouldn't necessarily span the length of the useful life of the plane in its entirety. And so when we think about what happened prior to 842 with operating leases, you're really only recognizing income and expense, depending on whether you're a lessee or lessor. If we just think about the lessee side, we're really just recognizing an expense straight line over the term of the agreement. And if you were to pull up a company's balance sheet like Delta, you're not actually going to understand what their obligation is to, say, a Boeing or say an Airbus, if that obligation is material and long-term, which is obviously a huge problem. But I do think, of course, the burden is the additional work required to comply with this new standard. So that's where software comes into play. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Who is affected by these amendments? So basically everybody. So entities that enter into any lease agreement, if you are a public entity in the US, you would comply with ASC 842, and that adoption deadline actually happened 3 years ago. So if you do work for a public company, my guess, you're pretty familiar with this. Now, privates and nonprofits, at least nonprofits that do not issue public debt, your compliance deadline was for fiscal years that began after December 15th, 2021, which typically means for anyone with a calendar year, fiscal year, your compliance period would have began last January. So January 1 of 2022, meaning that your audit for fiscal year 22 is when you have to comply with this new guidance. So as your audit may come up now or over the next few months, this is an area where your auditors are going to hope that you have A, spent time adopting this new standard appropriately, and B, potentially invested in technology to do so. And of course, this guidance does supersede ASC 840, which was the lease accounting guidance for many years prior to this.
And timing is important, right, Jason? That's why we're having this webinar now. Technically, we should probably be talking about this last year and you're helping organizations start implementing it, right? But it's never too late. And so regarding the definition of leases under the new standards, so for leases, all lease will have a right of use and a lease liability on the financial statements. It applies to all leases and sublease with some exceptions. And the exceptions are if you have a short-term lease, that is a lease that's less than 12 months, less than a year, or if you have month-to-month leases. And there are other exceptions that they're very specific to certain industry, which we're not going to cover here. The new standard defines the lease as a contract or part of a contract that conveys the right to use property for a period of time in exchange for consideration. This standard applies even if the agreement is between related parties.
Yep. And a couple things I will add as far as the applicability of the standard above. So keep in mind, although short-term leases, the new guidance does not apply, capitalizing an asset and liability, you do have to disclose in the footnotes the total expense that is specific to your short-term lease portfolio. So it's not as simple as say, hey, maybe we can arrange all of our leases as 12 months or less and get away with doing anything. The other piece of this too is that say you have a lease that is 12 months, but does have a renewal option in it. If you are reasonably certain that you will elect that option, and yes, that is a judgment, but an auditor can come in and suggest that, hey, this is obviously a renewal option that you will elect based on a variety of different factors. You do have to include that option in the initial term length evaluation. So that could still get scoped in. And then the non-lease components, although the standard does not necessarily apply to what you would consider to be a non-lease component, which for those of you unfamiliar with what that is, the non-lease component is a service within the lease contract that is specifically associated with an asset. So if you were to lease real estate, think about the maintenance that you're paying for on the side. Although the maintenance itself is not a physical asset, it's a service you're paying for that you're obviously only paying for because you are leasing that asset. you don't capitalize the cost of that service. However, there is a practical expedient that the boards offer to where if you choose to, you can combine your non-lease components with your lease components to make it easier to evaluate these contracts. Now, keep in mind that if the non-lease component is a variable expense, so if they will bill you based on actual costs, you don't include that in your liability calculation, which is what we're saying here. That just gets expensed as you incur it. However, if, say, a real estate landlord were to decide, rather than bill you for actual costs, we're just going to build into the contract a flat $50 a month fee for maintenance charges, and you elect the expedient, you can actually lump that in with your base rent and capitalize it. Now, it does put a larger liability balance on the balance sheet, but it also makes the calculation a little bit simpler. So it's just a cost benefit analysis there. But those would be the only other things I would add to this slide. Buu-Linh, do you have anything else you would like to cover before we move forward from here?
Yeah, no, we do have some questions. And so one of the question is, I guess it's saying, does it apply to 501c3 needs to adhere to the new lease standard? The answer is yes. Nonprofits is subjected to this standard. And the other question, is there any practical expedient as it relates to materiality of capturing the lease? I guess this is a requirement. So it's not, there's not a materiality threshold. This is an AICPA requirement, basically.
Yep, you are correct. Now, anyone who has international presence, IFRS 16, the international leasing standard, does call out any asset that has a valuation of $5,000 or less is qualified as a low value asset. That does technically get scoped out in the same fashion that a short-term lease does. You do have to disclose those, but Buu-Linh, to her point, under US GAAP standards, they don't mention materiality at all in the 842 guidance. It is assumed that organizations will determine their own materiality threshold that obviously gets approved by an external auditor. So it's not to say that you're going to be required to capitalize a stapler that you're leasing that costs $12, but the idea is that the standard itself is not going to suggest a dollar amount because every business, of course, is different.
My advice would be, connect with your auditors, because at the end of the day, they're going to be reviewing this. So if you're not sure about your materiality, I would, advise that you follow with your auditors and get some guidance there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And so what we're going to do next is just start talking about some of the integration capabilities. And one of the things that I did want to mention on the definition of a lease at the bottom there, just a couple of the highlighted items to take note of. Keep in mind, one of the items that Buu-Linh touched on, which is the leases of intangible assets, inventory, biological assets, you have to have a physically identifiable property, plant, and equipment to actually have a leased asset under this standard. So anything that is not physically identifiable is not going to count. And then also keep in mind that there has to be a specific period of time noted. So you need to make sure that your contract stipulates when the actual period of use begins and ends. If it is just an evergreen contract, unless there is any additional clause that might suggest when the contract might end, you may not necessarily have a lease that falls into scope. So those are some scoping considerations to think about. But otherwise, I think this gives everyone a good introduction to what you're doing with these leases and then also what actually will qualify. Now, as far as integrating with the ERP, Buu-Linh mentioned at the top of the presentation, of course, that she has many years of experience working with both legacy on-premise technologies as well as new cloud-based technologies. And I think regardless of which type of system you work with today, being able to integrate between various systems you use is important for a number of reasons. You can see listed on the screen here, the ability to just automate journal entries into your GL from a subledger, which we will demonstrate for you in a little bit. In addition to that, accounts payable, of course, it is much easier to just push expected AP into the AP system. It also eliminates human error. Anytime you can avoid requiring or asking a human being to punch numbers into a spreadsheet or even take a file and import it into another system, it just alleviates the possibility of there being an accidental error from a manual standpoint. And then, of course, we want to maximize the amount of time you spend in these ERP technologies that you utilize to enhance your business as opposed to just comply with an accounting standard. But Buu-Linh, I would certainly love to hear your feedback just as far as why you've seen integrations benefit your clients over the years as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of clients are on the SaaS solutions, cloud-based solutions, and there's, a wealth of third-party solutions out there that provides that seamless integration. Jason, I think it would be, obviously I know what the next few slides are, but could you also, provide, the folks in this webinar, provide them with some information. What if they're not on a cloud-based solutions? Let's say if they were on one of our other solutions that we support, like Dynamics GP, it's a Microsoft on-prem, solutions. How would LeaseQuery integrate with a solution like GP?
Yes, certainly. And we do have a large number of clients that use Microsoft Great Plains. What we would typically suggest, and I alluded to this a few minutes ago, but the next best step that you can get to if you're not going to automate the integration into a cloud system is to ensure that any file uploads are configured exactly as necessary in order to avoid having to manipulate these files before you import. So that's what LeaseQuery offers. What we call it from a packaging standpoint is our LeaseQuery Connect packaging. So we start by identifying whether your solution is on-premise or in the cloud. If it is on-premise, what we can offer is the ability to configure a spreadsheet that is going to be designed to import directly into whichever system that you utilize. And for any systems that we do partner with that might be on-premise, we would have those already configured through our partnership, so it wouldn't even require a scoping call. If we aren't partnered, it does just simply require one scoping call, but nevertheless, we would be able to configure that template so you don't have to do any manipulation and can import it directly for journal entries. Fantastic. And so I know we have a polling question open. I think for a couple of these polls, we actually wanted to showcase the results for the audience. So we will give everybody just a few more seconds or so to answer the polling question. What we've asked is how far along you are in your adoption process of 842. And some of the answers we've given are a little bit binary, and we recognize that some people might be in a little bit more of a gray area. However, I think it is worth seeing the steps that everybody has taken so far to understand whether there have been challenges or whether we might see challenges upcoming in the near future.
Hey, Jason, for the sake of, that's great. I didn't realize that the results could come so quickly.
Nice.
Oh, these are interesting results already complete. Oh, great. So we have 19% have not started, 45%.
Hey. But that's why we're here today, right? Because we know that although we would have suggested to start on this project a while ago, people inevitably delay these types of things. It's not a fun project per se, but we do offer the ability to expedite integrations and can get people up and running pretty quickly, especially given the volume of individuals we employ at LeaseQuery. We have over 400 employees at the company servicing this one product. So just something to think about if you do have an audit coming up in a couple months, we can get you up quickly. Now, As far as LeaseQuery's integrations go, and this will be similar to our integration with Acumatica, but we wanted to display where we actually sit in your full technology stack. So the main piece at the top you can see is that we're a puzzle piece into the general ledger system. So we perform all of the complex calculations required for 842. We'll create journal entries that you can post into the GL from LeaseQuery through that automatic API, as well as the ability to run your expected payables on your leases. And the payables can consist of not only your base rent payments, but any other additional payments included in the lease, whether those are capitalized on the balance sheet or not. And then the last piece, which isn't technically an integration per se, but we do automate the drafting of all of your quantitative disclosures necessary for the footnotes. So you can download those out of our system and just utilize those within your financial statements. So those are the three main ways that organizations use our technology alongside the ERP system that they have. And so what we have in addition to this are a few screenshots that we can show you. The screenshots are going to showcase where in the system you would go to actually run the journal entries. And we will demo this in just a couple minutes. On the left-hand side just showcases where you go to run journal entries in the LeaseQuery system. There is a button to actually export journal entries to Sage Intacct. When you do that, those journal entries pop up in the general journal. And again, we're going to actually show you how this works in just a few minutes, but this just gives you visual evidence that these transactions do flow directly from our system into Sage. And then the payables is going to look very similar, where what we're doing is exporting the payables into Sage Intacct, and then you would be able to go to the payables section and actually see those payments listed from a transaction standpoint. So again, pretty similar, but that just gives you a look at where you would find that information. Now, Acumatica, we also have some additional screenshots here to show you. This is where you would choose Acumatica as the specific GL of choice, and then we would be able to flow in the exact same manner journal entries into the Acumatica system. And you can see some of the screenshots from Acumatica where you would actually go to access the information once you push those journal entries through. I do not have an Acumatica sandbox to show today, but I do have a Sage one. So we are going to walk through Sage specifically, but we did want to give you guys a look at some of these screenshots in our PowerPoint presentation here today. Buu-Linh, do you have anything you would like to add as far as some of these integration screenshots go?
No. I think it's great that LeaseQuery has these direct integrations, really cover all areas, GL, reporting, and AP. So
excellent. So now we will move into our actual presentation of the software. And so just to give you guys some background on what we plan to cover here. So I am going to go through some of the automated accounting intelligence that LeaseQuery has to offer. One of them being the ability to test whether a lease qualifies as a finance or operating lease. Another one showcases how we will automate the calculation adjustments for a modification or an amendment. I'll showcase where you'll find our pre-built footnote disclosures. And then lastly, we'll take a look at how those integrations actually flow between systems. And then after that, we can wrap up, answer any questions that you all have. But bear with me just a second here as I go ahead and pull open the page to demo for you guys. Alrighty, so what I have done is entered into the LeaseQuery systems and my personal demo environment. And so where we will start is just going to be in one of my draft leases here on the left, where I have a label of complete entry, just showcasing that I have started to enter a lease, but it's reminding me to go back and finish it, which it has saved that lease in draft mode. And you'll see some headers at the top where our leases are stored. where you'll find all those disclosure reports, and then where you would go to actually run those journal entries that we talked about. So if I go into this draft lease right here, you'll notice the very first thing that we ask you to select is whether the lease qualifies as an operating or capital lease. Now, we would get a lot of questions as to, well, what if I don't know what the classification is? And so we do ask you to select it. The reason we ask up front is because we want to avoid the scenario where maybe you have 50 leases and you know all of them are operating, but you would, if we force you to go through the test, you would have to click a bunch of buttons every time you're entering a new lease. So we want to avoid requiring you to fill out a form for operating versus capital. What we do instead is if we jump into the section where we ask you to enter the date information for a lease, this is where the system will automatically start calculating for you whether this lease actually qualifies for what you originally selected. So I'm going to change this to 2019 here just for our demo purposes today. One of the things that you'll notice is that it gives me the ability to enter the useful life of the asset. Now, keep in mind, this is different from the lease term. This is the actual useful life of the fixed asset that you're leasing. So in this example, it's a relatively egregious example, but I have a 48-month useful life, so 4 years, but I've got a lease term that's about 12. So really, this should qualify as a finance lease because I'm leasing it for way longer than the useful life actually is. Now, if you recall in the general section, I selected that this was an operating lease. If I tried to move forward through the system with this information in, I'm going to get a pop-up notification that lets me know, hey, I indicated that this lease is an operating lease. However, the term length of the agreement of 156 months is actually greater than 75% of the useful life, which means it should actually be a capital lease. So it is then going to ask me if I either would like to change the lease to that capital designation. Now, also keep in mind that that will change to finance if your lease begins after the transition. But nevertheless, it also does offer an override capability. Now, the reason that that exists is because there is a practical expedient that allows you to forego reevaluating whether a lease is operating or finance under the new definitions if you at least designated the correct classification under ASC 840. So that could be a reason why you want to override. Now, we require comments for that exact reason. So you could type in here if you wanted to, practical expedient. Now, we will also create a capital versus operating document that outlines the full test being performed. If you were to override that test, you would see this information pop up in the test as well as the results. So that gives you an example of how, even if you're not entirely familiar with the 842 standard, the technology here is designed for any user of any education level to utilize and feel comfortable that they have entered the information correctly. Now, this was not something I outlined in the bullets, but just something while I am here, you'll also notice this reasonably certain to exercise line. This is where if you are reasonably certain to exercise a renewal option, you can designate that. And if you do, our system does let you know that we will include that renewal period in the initial term just based off of the US GAAP requirement. So when we confirm this and save this down, what you're going to notice in our dates up at the top is that our end date of the lease is going to include that renewal period. So from an amortization schedule standpoint, we will include the renewal period for you and capitalize the appropriate balance. But from an administrative standpoint, we will maintain that original contract end date that doesn't include the renewal option. That way, you know, when that contract comes up for renewal, that you do still have to execute it in real life, but from an accounting standpoint, it is already included within that amortization schedule. So that piece covers, just from, say, an accounting automation standpoint, some of the things that we can do to make this process easier for you, so you don't have to become a major expert on the accounting here. Now, if I entered into, say, a completed lease in the system, and just to give everybody a look where you'll find certain items in the financial section at the top here, this is where you'll be able to access the amortization schedule. So your 842 schedule would be available, which is going to include the capitalization of your liability, the capitalization of your asset on the right side, and then it also documents the borrowing rate that is used to actually calculate the present value of those payments. So these schedules are available for every lease. Now, the automation that I wanted to talk about in this example at the bottom here, when you go to make changes to the lease, you'll also see the ability to execute any of the possible changes, whether it's a renewal or a termination. We also offer the ability to impair assets. This is another area of lease accounting that changes, where operating leases were not previously subject to impairment because they weren't recognized as a physical asset on the balance sheet. But now that they are, you do have to showcase that you have evaluated for impairment in the same way you do with all of the other assets. And we have the ability to execute the change to the amortization schedule, which for operating leases isn't just a reduction in the asset value. You actually also have to change the way you recognize the expense on the asset. The asset value has to be straight lined after amortization, as opposed to your plug between your total straight line expense. So without going into too much detail on that, just keep in mind that it's something that requires a little bit of thinking. Now, this modification and remeasurement button, this is the key here. So whenever you have a change in your contract, the first thing that you need to think about is this an actual change to the contract that we executed where we signed an amendment? Or are we reevaluating the balance sheet items in our existing contract just based off of some circumstance? One example we give is maybe you have changed your mind about whether you're reasonably certain to elect a renewal or purchase option. Whichever one of these selections is correct, you would select the button down below. We're going to give you the option of each type. In this example, each type of reassessment would be available. And you'll notice that the accounting guidance is actually cited in the section here. So you can reference the accounting guidance and understand where we are actually getting the information from. All you have to do is understand what happened to your contract, and we automate all the calculation adjustments from there. So one example I always like to show is if you are reassessing the value of your asset and liability because there is a change in your payments that results from the resolution of a contract contingency. So one example that's easy would be if you had a lease incentive in the contract that you had to earn. Once you earn it, you could go in and actually make that change. Now, if I were to type in an effective date for this, one of the things you'll notice that we do in the system is that we would prevent you from actually updating the term length of the lease, because in this type of reassessment, you can't have a term length change because you haven't executed a new contract. So it prevents you from making changes that doesn't actually make sense based on the selection you've made. So that's another way in which what we try to do is make sure that no matter whether you understand the standard or not, the system's going to prevent you from making errors that doesn't necessarily make sense. Now, if we go back into that same lease and go down to the bottom for lease changes and we go to modify instead of reassessment, you'll notice that there are actually going to be 3 different modification options as opposed to 2. The top one is the normal modification, where we just change the asset and liability based on the same dollar amount. The bottom one, if you are partially terminating an agreement, whether it's reducing space in a real estate lease or reducing the number of assets in an equipment lease, what that's going to do is calculate a pro rata adjustment based on whatever your new liability is. It's then going to calculate the same percentage reduction in the asset, and any dollar amount difference will go to a gain or loss on partial termination. Now, you don't have to know anything about this. All you have to do is know, did I partially terminate my contract, or did I extend the contract or change the payments in the contract? It's that simple. And then in this example here, where if you are obtaining additional space in the contract, and the rent is at market value, a lot of times people come in here and they try to modify the existing lease. But what we would then do is let you know, hey, if you are adding to your lease contract and you're paying market value for it, you're really just entering into a new lease, even if it's built into the same contract. It's an asset that you're leasing at that moment for market value. So what we would suggest you do is create a new record in the system so you can maintain the existing lease at the existing borrowing rate and then obtain a new borrowing rate for the new asset. So again, these are things that I believe, based on the expertise we have on staff at LeaseQuery, we're able to build all of this accounting intelligence into the tool, as opposed to just creating, say, an Excel-like module where you just throw information in and it just sort of calculates your present value obligation. And trust me, even if you don't think that you have complex leases, some of this stuff isn't even necessarily a complex change, but the accounting requirements make it complex, which again, is very frustrating. And trust me, when we think about comparing this to Excel, it's not going to be fun utilizing Excel trying to do this. And another thing Excel doesn't do that I'll point out real quick is create an audit trail. For example, whenever you add a lease into the tool, it's going to track the user who adds the lease as well as the user who approves it. There's going to be a control there for entry and approval separation. And then every time there's a change made, you'll see that there as well.
Hey, Jason, I am actually learning a lot from this webinar myself.
Excellent. Excellent.
I don't know about the folks that are on this webinar. You know, there is a lot more complexity there than that I would imagine, but it's great that there's a solution like this that handles all of that. It's almost like managing your lease for dummy. I need something to, provide that guidance. So.
Right. Yep. Yeah, it's a lot. And I think sometimes it's almost too much to take in at once. So that's why I at least try to simplify some of the messaging and not go into too much detail. But that is, again, yet another example as to why people look to these types of softwares to do this for them. The reporting studio is another huge aspect, right? We talked about the pre-built disclosures. If you just navigate to our topic 842 folder right here, we've got all the disclosures built in, not to mention we also have roll forward reporting available, which is very valuable in the future. So again, with fixed assets as an example, no one's auditing your full fixed asset balance every year. If they're comfortable with balance A as of the end of one year, they're just going to monitor the activity as they go forward. And that's what you get to do when you're utilizing the roll forward reports in here. Now, this complete disclosure report right here, if I were to just run this, let's just say for just a quarter period here, what this is going to do is give me a look at all of my disclosures that are necessary. So we can go ahead and give this just a minute to load here, but all of the quantitative requirements will pull open on this specific document. And you can even see here for anyone that might have international presence, we have a separate document that is going to provide you all of the disclosures associated with IFRS. And it's going to look relatively similar. The US GAAP version of this is going to be a little bit more formalized, where we have income statement balances at the top and then balance sheet items at the bottom. But we'll give this just a minute here. But again, the idea is that we want to prevent you from having to accumulate this information at the end of the year. We're just going to pull all of it together and then give you guys the ability to take a look at it. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this here for now. I am going to pull open, because one of the main things we wanted to make sure we showed you all before we left today is our ability to integrate with the Sage Intacct. So I'm going to go ahead and log into a separate environment here real quick, which we just refer to right now as our Sage Intacct demo client here. When we jump into this journal entry section here at the top, I'm going to run these by the actual lease level here. And I'm going to go ahead and click the go button and just run journal entries for this January of 2023 period. When we come to the bottom, very simple, you're going to see the journal entries pop up. And one of the ones we always like to use is this one. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just copy this lease ID and filter this journal entry just for this lease right here. So we should see just one journal entry pop up down below. So what we have the ability to do is, we saw the export buttons here. We also have this available as well. So if I were to go and first create the accounts payable in Sage Intacct, I just click the go button. It asks me if I am ready to send that information into our Sage Intacct environment. We'll give this a second here. And then once it exports into Sage, it's just going to let us know whether it was successful or not. So hopefully this will be successful for us, and we can actually log into the Sage environment and give you all a look at what the journal entries will look like and where you would just generally go. I imagine that most of you would know where to go to actually find this information. But just again, to give you all a visual, I think it's helpful to see how this will work.
And Jason, if the company isn't running Sage Intacct, let's just assume they were running like an MIP or a GP, you would still click the go, but it would generate a file. Would that be how it works?
Essentially. So what we would do, you would click this go button. We would have a separate button available here that would showcase your specific GL. So Microsoft Great Plains is an example. You'd be able to download that very specific export file that you could import into that GL system.
Okay. And if I know we have a few more minutes left, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about what would an implementation look like, for LeaseQuery?
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, LeaseQuery is trying as hard as we can to make the implementation as seamless as possible, as opposed to requiring, say, 10 different steps, getting you onboarded, doing trainings. We do offer a very simplified approach now, where if you want a little bit more of a self-service implementation, you can sign up. We'll schedule a kickoff call and make sure that you're ready to input your chart of accounts as well as the dimensions of the business if necessary. Once we complete that, we're going to build your environment and just hand it off to you. As far as the data entry process goes, you can either use our basic lease entry function that we showed you earlier, or we do offer an upload template. So if you wanted to import that data utilizing a spreadsheet, you'll be able to do so. And I will also make mention that LeaseQuery does have OCR AI technology. We are currently just making absolute sure that it works as well as we want it to before we start offering it to our clients, but we are pretty close to having that done. So for those of you that have a keen interest in utilizing AI to get your lease information in, stay tuned. We will make sure to update you all as we continue to refine the functionality that we have developed there. And of course, after we get done today, we're happy to answer any other questions related to that. But I did want to quickly pull open the Sage Intacct environment that I have here. When we jump into the payables section and then just go to our bills that we have available, you'll notice that what we just sent over, and you can see that by this reference bill number, is available. And when I click to view this bill available in Sage, you're actually going to notice as we go, first off, it's available in draft mode. And you'll also notice too, that this doesn't just encompass base rent. It's also encompassing CAM payments, insurance payments, tax. So we do have the ability to itemize these payment values as they're coming over to Sage Intacct, as opposed to just lumping them in as just one big cash payment, especially if you have to pay various vendors for each one of those line items. So it's a very seamless integration. You'll notice that the reference number is also available in that bill number here, which ties directly back to that lease ID that we had in the system. And I would say, just due to time constraints, same function with the journal entries. You'll notice if you go to the general journal here, if we go to general ledger, this is where you would go into the journals. And then if you go to your general journal right here, this is where you would find the similar transactions available. So quite a simple process there. The last thing I'll mention, if we go back to the reports, just to give you guys a quick look at that disclosure I mentioned, this right here is going to be the complete disclosure report. exportable to Excel, and it does offer all of the itemized detail for each line item here. But this top portion here, this covers all of your income statement line items related to 842. And then the bottom half is going to be cash flow statement, balance sheet adjustments, and then all of the weighted average calculations. So this, and then a separate report we offer for your maturity analysis or your overtime lease commitments report. That's all you're going to need for disclosure purposes. So those are all available. Of course, if you're interested in more information, whether it's about LeaseQuery or whether it's about Marcum Technologies practice as well, that's our last polling question. So we can reach out to you all, of course. I think that will cover us today as far as the demonstration. But as I've mentioned before, we are more than happy if any of you are interested in seeing a more robust demonstration. We're obviously happy to schedule that. So I will go back to the slide deck here. We've got a few minutes for questions.
Yes, we have a few minutes. And I just wanted to mention another point. I know that Jason had shown how LeaseQuery sent over the transactions that created the accounts payable bill. And I know that they're, just with our clients that are on Sage Intacct, many are also on running bill.com, and all the AP transactions are being paid through bill.com. And I just a point to note that even when the bills are created in Sage Intacct, when you do the sync, whether you invoke the sync, whether the sync runs automatically overnight, the bill will automatically sync over to bill.com, and then it processes the payment. It is a bi-directional integration. So I just wanted to mention that. And yes, so here are our contact. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either of us. And I just wanted to mention one other thing. We will be having another webinar late next month. I believe it's February the 28th. It's on Sage Intacct payroll. So Sage Intacct and ADP have partnered. And so it's really Sage Intacct payroll powered by ADP, where we will be looking at the ADP payroll, but also the integration between ADP payroll with Sage Intacct. So it should be another good presentation. If you're available, feel free to sign up. But do we have a few more minutes left to answer any questions here? There is a lot of questions here. What we're going to do is, does this work with QuickBooks? Here, there's another ERP solution. Jason, does it integrate with QuickBooks?
So we don't necessarily have an API built with QuickBooks today, but what I would tell any QuickBooks user is that the way that we go about developing our APIs is just based on demand. So a lot of our QuickBooks users have never expressed a desire for that full integration, since we do technically offer a spreadsheet by default to upload. But if you let us know that you're interested, we do have technology we've invested in to build as many custom integrations as necessary. It's something we can do for sure.
Great. I know we're not going to be able to get through all of these questions. All these questions are great. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow up after this presentation and make sure that we address all your questions. But I wanted to thank everyone for attending this webinar. Hope that you got something out of it. I certainly did myself. And so I wanted to thank Jason Parker for going through this presentation and showing us LeaseQuery. I thought it was very, very helpful. And if, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, but we will definitely follow up with everyone with regards to your questions. So thank you so much. Thank you for attending. Hope to see you soon. Thank you, Aaron.